if you're going to make these decisions, you've got to explain why, I think. So
exactly.
We are in a rare agreement.
Rare agreement on that. So, Lizzie, I believe you've just come back from a lovely little trip to the seaside.
Yeah, I wouldn't call it a holiday, but yes, I was in Brighton for the Trade Union Congress for the last couple of days, which was a lot of fun, always very interesting. But I have to say I was staying at a hotel that was next to a nightclub, which was pounding music until 2 a.m. I don't know whether that was union general secretaries going clubbing or just like the normal people of Brighton. So yeah, a bit knackering, but it was great fun. It's always really useful. I think if you're interested in Labour, it's always really useful to see what the trade unions think. And the Prime Minister came and gave a speech. So yeah, it was busy.
Do they like him? Is he a pal or?
Yeah, I think so.
Is he the new Blair?
I think there's a lot of, there's a lot of goodwill. There's a lot of support for what Labour are trying to do, particularly the fact that they're moving so quickly on the workers' rights reforms. But, Keir Starmer came down with quite a tough message. He gave a speech and said, look, I'm going to be honest with you. We've given above inflation public sector pay rises, but I won't risk economic stability at any price. So you've got to be aware of that going forward. And, there was a slightly muted reception to that. There was someone who kept shouting tax the rich from the audience, which is something that a lot of, like several unions, including the Trade Union Congress, who are sort of more moderate, think that Labour really should be looking at a wealth tax. So there was, there's a bit of that. There was some unhappiness about the winter fuel allowance. There's some unhappiness about two-child benefit cap. So I think there are some unions who think, they're the critical friend, aren't they? Mm. But there's a lot of goodwill still. I think everyone was very excited to have a Labour Prime Minister and to feel like they're being taken seriously. A few of the General Secretaries I spoke to said, I hadn't been into number 10 in 14 years and I've been in twice since June, so just July. So yeah, I think it's a watch and see. How about you? What have you been up to while I've been at the seaside?
Well, I've been on College Green. We at the Daily Express organised a bit of a rally against these winter fuel cuts. It's one of our crusades, and we had an amazing turnout. We had a really good show of Conservative MPs, 2 leadership contenders. We had also all of Reform, Nigel Farage leading from the front there, and we had some Green parliamentarians, including Baroness Jenny Jones, the Green peer. So really, we had like the full spectrum from the Greens to Reform. You don't often see that happening these days, but such is the anger about these winter fuel cuts that's what happens. You bring together Jenny Jones and Nigel Farage in one place to protest about these cuts.
That is quite an unlikely coalition, isn't it? Winter fuel has been the big story this week. Let's get into that.
Yeah,
Do you
absolutely.
want to talk us through what happened with the vote?
The vote, well, huge revolt, I would say, from the Labour side, and more than 50 didn't bother to show up on the day. Now, Labour spinners insist that only 12 were not, or around 12 were not authorised to miss that vote. But essentially, it's a bit of a smoke and mirrors there. You've got more than 50 Labour MPs not turning up for a massive vote like this. They've all been given, dispensation to disappear for the day, dental appointments or very important constituency business. These are the excuses that are bandied around when there's a difficult vote and people don't want to take part in it. Now, obviously, because Labour's got such a huge majority, it really didn't matter. But I think those MPs who didn't bother to show up, those MPs who did vote this through, this is not going away. I know the next election is probably 5 years away. It could be 4, but probably 5. People will not forget this. They will not forget how those MPs voted. We have got a very difficult winter ahead. As I came to meet you this morning, Lizzie, I was just aware how cold it is this morning. We're only in early September. It's 5 degrees in London. This is not a good sign. So people who are at home all day, which older people generally are in their homes more in the day, will be shivering already, and by the time you get to December, January, you just wonder what's going to happen. And that £300, obviously, for those over 80, that's a huge chunk to lose. It's a huge chunk to lose. The anger about over this is palpable. We have sacks and sacks and sacks of letters. We had a picture in the paper this week of all the letters we've had in protest about this. I mean, I just cannot really stress how angry people are. And it isn't just pensioners who are angry about this. It's people, it's relatives, it's younger people who can see how cruel this is.
Yeah, it isn't only pensioners who are angry. I spoke to quite a few people about this when I was in Brighton at the TUC, privately, a number of sort of senior people in the union movement pretty uncomfortable about it. But I think there are some people in that space who are saying, well, okay, is the government going to bring forward any kind of mitigations around this? Because obviously we're starting to turn our attention towards the budget at the end of October. Could there be something in that would make life easier for pensioners? I mean, the Housing Minister, Matthew Pennycook, yesterday said no. And Rachel Reeves has been very clear, Number 10, very clear that they're not going to change their minds on this. But I wonder whether there's still a while yet, and whether that pressure remains to do something about it, because it is a really tough call. I think that the government have explained repeatedly that there is this hole in the public finances, and they're having to try and find money everywhere, and that there's lots of difficult choices to make. But I think, there are people in Labour who are uncomfortable with the idea of taking money from pensioners
and giving it to train drivers.
I wouldn't accept that as a premise.
14%, Lizzie. I mean, it's huge.
Sure, but I think also there are a lot of, I think that train drivers are workers. They're people who are entitled to be paid properly.
On an average salary of £60,000.
I think they're entitled to be paid properly, and they're entitled to ask more for whatever they need for their labour. And the government needs to sort of, make sure that work pays. That's what they're entitled to do.
I don't think if you're on the trains.
Sure, but I don't think you need to necessarily set them up as like pensioners versus workers all the time. But I do think that is an argument that ministers will have to combat, because our friends in the Conservative Party, in the Express, making that point, the government needs to be ready to defend that, and I don't know whether they're making that argument well enough at the moment. But I think they're very keen to say, well, we're not pitting one group against another. There's no but I would say, and I think Mirror readers are obviously Mirror readers vote Labour, but there are a number of people who are concerned about this. So I do think it's tricky, and I'll be interested to see kind of where it goes forward, because with the vote, one person voted against it, John Trickett, veteran left-winger, who doesn't seem to have been kicked out of the party yet.
No.
Obviously, we understand that the whips are sort of considering taking action against both him and the 12 unauthorised absences. You could say that in the scheme of parliamentary rebellions, it's not enormous. There's been so many rebellions over the past few years, particularly during the Brexit years. But, during the pandemic, I think Boris Johnson had votes on lockdown, on things like that. There was one on, I think, bringing in the tiers rules that something like more than 50 Tory MPs voted against. So we've got one MP voting against. I'm not sure that necessarily tells us the full picture of how much unhappiness there is in Labour, but it does tell us about that Number 10 are perhaps, that Keir Starmer's in a position of strength, that's the size of the rebellion.
Well, I don't know. And we were in week two of the new term, and we've already had this, rebellion, revolt, or non-event, however you want to pitch it. But I would say, having 50 of your MPs not turn up is not a great sign of faith in this policy, is it? And I think you mentioned mitigations, and obviously we are continuing to campaign against this policy, but also to push for mitigations and to prevent other benefits being taken off pensioners, because they do seem to be in the firing line. The free bus pass, that is also in the crosshairs, and particularly the single person council tax discount, that really seems to be something that they're looking at scrapping, which effectively is a widow's tax. That really hits people who are bereaved and older. So, you could lose that discount on top of the winter fuel allowance, potentially your bus pass. This is really, it feels like pensions are being really targeted. And I just think whatever mitigations there may be, in this upcoming budget, I just don't think it's going to be enough to calm the anger about this. And I think if they continue to pursue pensioners in this way, if they continue to kind of target policies at them, I just think the anger is going to increase and increase. But also I think there is a big problem now for the government in that the 22 billion black hole that they endlessly cite, there are questions over that. The Financial Times today, it has run a story about how it put in a Freedom of Information request asking for details of how they've come to this figure, and it was refused on the basis that the Treasury needs more time to make sure the figures are accurate. Well, I mean, you'd pretty much hope that those figures are accurate, seeing as they put them out in July and justified the winter fuel cuts on the back of them. If they cannot say with certainty in September that those figures are accurate, then people are right to question why they're doing this in the first place. It feels, if you cannot justify this, if you cannot lay out the details, it feels wrong to then take money off pensioners. So I think they've got serious questions to answer on that side of it as well.
There is a broader question about publishing the kind of rationale behind this sort of thing. I think Keir Starmer came under, had a lot of questions from Rishi Sunak yesterday during PMQs about whether there had been an impact assessment done of the cut to the winter fuel allowance, because we know it's going to affect 10 million pensioners, but government departments normally do work into, what does that mean? How will it impact health, mental health, all sorts of things? And it's interesting that the government don't seem to want to talk about, I can understand why they don't want to talk about it, but that they don't feel that they need to publish that because, it's a problem governments of all sides, really, because yesterday I was reminded of when the Conservatives cut universal credit by the £20 uplift of universal credit after the pandemic. We spent ages campaigning and shouting about that, and eventually we managed to get the internal analysis of it, but only after a ruling by the watchdog and the government instructing lawyers to try and block its publication. So, the Conservatives didn't want to publish that stuff either. But then Keir Starmer told me in May that they should publish it. So I asked Number 10 yesterday, does he still believe that is important? And they didn't want to get into it. But, principles of transparency apply across the board. And so if you're going to make these decisions, you've got to explain why, I think. So
exactly.
We are in a rare agreement.
Rare agreement on that.
In the grand scheme of things, the winter fuel allowance wasn't a massive rebellion, was it? I mean, obviously there is a strength of feeling there, but in the years that I've been covering politics, there have been far more crazy votes than that. I mean, the Brexit years, Liz Truss. I mean, are there any that stand out to you?
It was certainly not the most dramatic of rebellions. I'll give you that, Lizzie. That's for sure. The one that really sticks out is October 2022.
Oh gosh.
And it a lot has happened since then. But cast your mind back to that day, and I remember it was the day when the then Home Secretary Suella Braverman had to quit or was ousted. We never quite got to the bottom of that. But she'd been caught sending emails to Sir John Hayes, a Conservative MP, that she shouldn't have been. And it caused a big fuss. I think from memory, she quit kind of lunchtime-ish, early afternoon. It was a huge, huge story. Obviously, a Home Secretary falling on their sword. It was a big moment. This is obviously going to be the front page for the next day. And by that evening, that had been superseded by this chaotic scene, should we say, in the division lobbies where there was a fracking vote, which you wouldn't think that was the most controversial. It wasn't even a government; it was an opposition motion, and it became this huge thing. It was treated as a confidence vote in the government. The Conservative Party were whipping incredibly hard on it. But many MPs were unhappy about it. By that point, the wheels had already well and truly fallen off the Liz Truss premiership, and the party was just unwhippable. And in those division lobbies, there were these chaotic scenes. Chris Bryant, the Labour MP, he went on TV pretty much straight away and said, "I've seen bullying, intimidation going on." He named Jacob Rees-Mogg to raise coffee. They obviously denied it. It was all getting very kind of fractious. And then it emerged that Wendy Morton, who was the chief whip, had quit. But then there were briefings that actually she hadn't quit, and nobody could tell us if she quit or if she hadn't quit or if she'd been sacked or was she still the chief whip. Nobody knew. And this went on, and it was just absolute carnage. And we already could see where this story was going, but that day you just thought, this is game over. There is no recovering from this. You've lost a Home Secretary, and then you've got dust-ups in the division lobbies over a fracking vote that really should not be that important in the grand scheme of it, because it wasn't, as I say, it was an opposition day debate. It wasn't one of the kind of key votes, and it all just got quite crazy. And I went to the Red Lion, the pub where the journalists and MPs drink, afterwards with many of my colleagues, and we were all asking the MPs and various spinners for the government, is Wendy Morton still the chief whip? Nobody could tell us. And at 1 a.m. the next morning, we all received a message from one of the spinners telling us she remained in post. And it had obviously taken that many hours to work out what on earth they were doing with Wendy Morton, whether she was in, whether she was out, whether they wanted her in or out, I don't know. But yeah, it was a very chaotic day.
That was absolutely wild that day. I mean, I think votes, kind of the atmosphere of them, it tells you so much about where the parties are. Because obviously, I think if you're sort of watching it on television, you might not, it always looks a bit confusing because people sort of just disappear. But essentially, because Parliament's so old-fashioned, the MPs will walk through what are called the division lobbies, the yes and no, to be counted for the votes. And I think on that night, there were Jacob Rees-Mogg, Therese Coffey, who were like allies of Liz Truss, were sort of trying to collar people, being like, don't go in the wrong lobby. And, and you do hear of that in other votes, whips trying to stop people from going through, people accidentally going in the wrong place. I think Boris Johnson once tried to get MPs to vote for a general election, which he had to try several times to get through in 2019. And so those moments where MPs are kind of casting their votes are when they do a lot of their horse trading, and they'll talk to each other in, sometimes if you've got rebels in with the government or whatever, they'll talk to each other in those lobbies. It can be quite dramatic. And I think, I find it quite hard to think about the Brexit years now, because it was that sort of 2017 to 19 period where there were just votes all the time, and Theresa May didn't have a majority anymore because she chucked it away at the 2017 general election. And so every vote was a sort of exercise in trying to get every single person to come with you. And there were such strong opinions. And so being a whip during that period would have been pretty unpleasant, don't you think?
Oh, I don't know. I think I'd probably quite enjoyed that.
Knocking heads together.
I mean, you have to have a certain disposition to be a whip, but having a good whipping operation is absolutely crucial. And I think actually for Keir Starmer, the hardline approach early on is probably the right one, because once you have tasted blood, once you've rebelled for the first time, it's a lot easier to do it for the second time. So you have to kind of nip that in the bud very early. You don't want a parliament full of rebellions. Look what happens to Conservatives on that front. It's very hard to maintain unity if you've got MPs who are prepared to rebel. And actually, most MPs really don't want to rebel, because there are consequences not only for your career, but also for your constituency. You will be looked on less favourably, let's say that, for certain things. So, it's a big step to rebel, but once you have done it, you're in that naughty corner in the House of Commons, and you just go on and on. So I think probably Keir Starmer was right on that front to be quite hardline.
Yeah, you do get those sort of serial rebels sometimes. Sometimes they're sort of tolerated as, having just a real strength of feeling about a lot of things. And some leaders think, well, just leave them to it because they're not really a threat. But I think, Keir Starmer took a very tough line when he suspended the whip from 7 MPs who rebelled on the two-child benefit cap earlier this year. And I think that's obviously played a part in how MPs voted on the winter fuel allowance, because that was a slightly different situation because it was to do with the King's Speech, which is the government's legislative plan. Like, if you can't back the government on their plans, their planned laws for, the next year, then should you be in the party, I think is the argument they would make. So maybe that's why you only really had John Trickett as the rebel, and then most of them found somewhere else to be. Another issue that is very much on the agenda, we've talked about it a bit, is the NHS. The impact on, what a difficult position that the NHS is in. And we've had this big report on the state of the NHS out, and the Prime Minister's been talking about it. I think, that is one of the big things that voters are really, really care about. We saw it during the election. It's always something that people care about. And this report was really shocking. Do you want to talk us through it?
Yeah, I think one of the things that struck me about it, it's Lord Darzi, who was a Labour health minister under the last Labour government. He now sits as an independent peer. And he was asked to write this report. He's done it at speed, and because there is a sense of urgency about this. It talks about the massive reform that's needed in the NHS, about the need for modernisation, that actually not enough money has been put into the right things. Now, a lot of money has been put into the NHS. Money gets thrown into the NHS. It's almost like a bottomless pit. And I think everyone could see that. The Health Secretary, Wes Streeting, has said too much money is wasted in the NHS. You have to find a way of targeting the money better. And this report says that actually more investment is needed in things like IT and making things more efficient. And we know that the NHS is really not efficient at all. That really is something that has to be gripped. But that is a huge, huge thing. For ever since I can remember, people have been talking about making the NHS more efficient. But it is impossible. It is turning around a juggernaut at high speed, and you just cannot ever really get a grip of it. Nobody's ever really seemed to be able to get a grip of it. And everyone comes in promising to overhaul the NHS. But also because of the way it is treated like a national religion, there is also great sensitivity about it. So, governments are reluctant almost to make some of the changes that perhaps are needed because they are worried about the perception of voters. And there's always this... particularly with a Conservative government, there's always this worry that they will be accused of trying to privatise the NHS by their back door. So perhaps, in a way, a Labour government is more free to do wholesale reforms because it has the cover of being the party that invented the NHS. Maybe it can be more radical in the way that the Conservatives would never get away with. So there is, perhaps some leeway there. But it also struck me that actually the staffing in the NHS has gone up by 17% since 2019. But there's been no real increase in productivity. Mm-hmm. And this is the essential problem with the NHS, isn't it? You can chuck money at it, you can boost staffing levels, but you're not getting out any better outcome. And how you resolve that, I do not know. Now, this is obviously the first step in that. But will we be sat here in 10 years' time? Well, who knows anyway if we'll be sat here in 10 years' time. Let's not think about that. But will we be sat here in 10 years' time saying the same thing? There'll be another report. There'll be another push for revolutionising the infrastructure of the NHS to make it more efficient. And, this will be another long-forgotten, dusty academic exercise on a shelf somewhere. Who knows?
Yeah, that is certainly a good point. 10 years ago, I was a health correspondent, and everybody was saying exactly these things. I think everybody, all health experts, doctors, hospital directors, all sort of agree on the fact that we've got an aging population, people are getting sicker, and that we're really struggling to deal with demand and rising costs. And I mean, one of the things that's very, very clear in this report, and Lord Darcy is absolutely damning, is about the impact of a decade of austerity on the NHS, on how hospitals were forced to pull funding from buildings, from technology, from all of that sort of thing. They said, he said that the 2010s were the most austere decade for the NHS since it was formed. So you can see that chipping away all this time has left us with crumbling buildings, with a health service that's not fit for purpose. He's also really critical of the 2012 reforms by the then Health Secretary Andrew Lansley, which were distracting, didn't get anything done. So I can understand, like what you were saying, that it's very hard for anyone to attempt to reform it, because that was one of the last times that they really attempted some sort of meaningful reforms, and it was not very successful. But you had that whole period of time, and then the pandemic, and something that's been picked up in the COVID inquiry, is how the country wasn't prepared for the pandemic because of austerity, because of all of the kind of cutting of funding. And I think that's left us with a really difficult kind of starting point for any sort of reforms, because hospitals eat money. They just, and that you can't just give more money to the health service, but over and over again to just pour into a black hole. But if you don't, then it will collapse. So you're in a really tough position. And I'll be quite interested to see, Wes Streeting and Keir Starmer have been talking about moving, trying to shift away from hospitals to community care, which is something that, again, that health experts have been saying for so long, that is a better way to run things, because putting people in hospital is not actually good for them. It's stressful. They're quite likely to pick up something else. Elderly people tend to deteriorate quite quickly in hospital. It's much better to treat people in the community where it's less disruptive, and they're probably more likely to be known by the staff that treat them, who are going to understand, okay, you're somebody who might not tell me that you've got this extra concern because you don't want to, you feel embarrassed, or you don't want to put anyone out. And so they're able to address that. But I think that would be a massive reform in the way that things are done.
I think there is, and I think Lord Darcy was apparently reluctant to take on this brief because he didn't.
Not surprised.
Yeah, it's not a great subject to have to tackle, is it? But he was worried about the politicisation of this route, and I think he didn't want to be dragged into that, and so he has tried to avoid being political. Now, Keir Starmer has not tried to avoid being political. I mean, let's be honest, he's talking about how voters should be angry about this. They should be angry. He's trying to make voters angry about this.
But aren't they angry anyway?
Well, you shouldn't have to tell them to be angry then, should you? I mean, why is he telling them to be angry?
Maybe he's just recognising what people feel. I mean, I think people are quite angry about ambulance waits, about how long it takes to get a GP appointment. I think people are angry. And obviously, you can blame the Conservatives for that, but some of these problems are longer in the making than 2010.
But he's definitely trying to make this a political thing. And it's part of this ongoing operation, is it the £22 billion black hole, the prisons. Obviously, we saw a big release of prisoners this week, some leaving in Lamborghinis, some being sprayed with champagne, but obviously trying to blame that on the Conservatives. This, obviously, again, they're trying to blame voters should be angry. It's part of this wider political attack on the Conservative record. But then you also have, Professor Sir John Bell, the Regius Professor of Medicine at Oxford University, and people will perhaps remember him from being one of the kind of voices in the COVID pandemic, one of the expert voices during that time. He has said that that there is an elephant in the room on this, that to really enact reform in the NHS, you have to go to battle with doctors in the BMA. And the BMA, as we have seen, has become increasingly radicalised. He talks about how they have a stranglehold on this process, that they block reform. He talks about how you can actually modernise the processes in the NHS through the use of AI, but he says try getting that past the doctors, it's not going to wash. And so I think there is a big issue there. And obviously the junior doctors were given a big pay settlement too by the Labour government. But again, there was no productivity promises in return for that. And productivity is what we're talking about here, increasing the good outcomes in the NHS. Now, I think that is a really serious thing that Wes Streeting is going to have to tackle. He is going to have to really go to war with the BMA if he wants to get the kind of changes in working practices that will make significant differences in the NHS.
I think Wes Streeting has shown, though, that he's not afraid of having a bit of a ding-dong.
Yeah, no, he likes a ding-dong generally. I think that's his general mode.
Like, before the election, he had a few times where he was quite critical of GPs particularly.
Yeah.
And
that seems to be a big problem,
yeah,
actually.
and I think he doesn't seem very happy with the way that the GP contract and the way that has been operating. And so I think that there is... he's shown himself to be more willing to criticise NHS staff, particularly doctors, who are the most high paid, than other sort of members of the Labour Party, which is quite interesting because Labour is traditionally not very critical of the NHS. Yeah. So I think he's sort of shown that he's up for that. It will be interesting to see because there is always that tension, and I think you could apply that across a number of different professions of AI and how you deal with that, because there's loads of research showing that AI could be really useful in the health service, but also none of us want AI to take our jobs, right? You and I
absolutely.
Don't want it to take our jobs either.
It's going to happen, Lizzie.
Yeah, probably quite quickly. But, so doctors don't want people to take AI to take their jobs or to, and there is also the question about, do patients want AI to encroach on some of the contact that they get? Because I think you've seen as well with GPs about how elderly patients particularly really value like being able to see their GP in person, and Matt Hancock was very keen on this whole idea of, trying to do digital consultations. Lots of people don't want that.
No, but I don't think it's really about that. I think it's more on the kind of diagnostic side, on the admin side, on the behind the scenes thing. Yeah. It's not about sending robots to talk to elderly patients.
No, but I think that there is a broader question about that. I think they've talked a lot about how AI could be used in like diagnosing lung cancer and things like that, and maybe getting rid of hospital bureaucracy would be a good thing. Yeah. But the NHS is also a huge employer, so that is something that you'd have to take seriously. So yeah, I think that is a tricky thing, but I think Wes Streeting has shown himself to be somebody who's not afraid of a fight. It just depends whether it's the one he wants to have or not.
Well, watch this space. Lizzie, tell me your moment of the week.
So my moment of the week is away from Westminster, was the US presidential TV debate. I think we were sort of all really interested to see how this one would go, because the last debate proved so consequential that Joe Biden ended up dropping out of the race. So the stakes were really high. But Kamala Harris did really, really well, and actually managed to, she managed to sort of unsettle Trump, to sort of get him on the back foot by sort of almost teasing him, laughing at him, sort of saying, you're being a bit over the top, you're being a bit weird, no one wants to come to your rallies because they're bored, and he can't deal with it.
No.
So that was really interesting. And then obviously afterwards, she was endorsed by Taylor Swift, which as a huge Swiftie, I was delighted to see. How about you?
Well, forgive me, this one is a little self-indulgent, but at the dispatch box in the Commons on Tuesday, in the opening minutes of the winter fuel debate, Mel Stride, the Shadow Work and Pensions Secretary, he praised the Daily Express and the campaign group Silver Voices, the charity Age UK, for our work on campaigning against the winter fuel cuts. And I think, often people can be quite cynical about the press, but I think the Daily Express, we always pride ourselves on being a crusading newspaper. We always put our readers first, and it was really nice to see that being recognised in the House of Commons. But also Silver Voices and Age UK, who we've done enormous amounts of work with over the years on many, many issues that are important to our readers. So it's good to see them praised too. So yes, forgive the self-indulgence, but it was a really nice moment. Well, thank you for listening, and follow us on our socials at Daily Express
and at Daily Mirror. And you can also follow us on YouTube at the Division Bell podcast.
And we'll see you next week.
Bye.